let's discuss my top 3 pre-flop tips to help you crush low stakes, no limit Texas Hold'em poker games. Understand that you have to make a pre-flop decision every single hand you are dealt in. And if you consistently make errors before the flop, even if they're small, that's going to result in you spewing little bits of money, or maybe big bits of money, over and over and over again to your opponents. And that's going to ensure you lose in the long run. And I don't want you to lose in the long run. I want you to win. Following these 3 tips I'm about to share with you will help ensure that you do not consistently make blunders. Now, realize we are only going through 3 main spots today. You want to make sure you understand how to play pre-flop well, so I have tons of game theory optimal pre-flop charts in the pokercoaching.com app and on the website for you for whatever type of no-limit Hold'em game you play. Today, though, we are going to be discussing specifically 100 big blind deep cash games or tournaments where no rake is taken out of the pot and there's also no ante in play. If they take rake out of every pot in your cash game, play a little bit tighter. If you're playing in a tournament where there's an ante in play, play a little bit looser. We have charts for all this at pokercoaching.com, but those are the charts we're going to be using in today's video. Tip number 1 is to raise or fold when first in. When everyone folds around to you, or if you're just first to act, either raise or fold. Do not just call the big blind. I can't type. The blind. The big blind. Calling allows everyone else to see the flop for cheap or free if they're in the big blind. And if you're in a cash game, it also results in that everyone pays the rake if rake is taken out of every individual pot. Realize that if you put in 1 big blind and the big blind gets to see the flop for free, that's really, really bad. Because if you would have raised, they would have folded out a lot of their marginal stuff or put in more money with their marginal stuff out of position, both of which should be very, very good for you. Instead, you let them see the flop for free, they get to realize their equity and go from there. And that's bad. Okay? Also, I've heard many players say that, well, my hand's not quite good enough to raise, so I'm going to call. But that is incorrect. If your hand is not good enough to raise, you should fold. Calling is not the answer. Let's take a look at a few raise first in ranges. Here we have the low jack, raise first in range. The low jack is first to act if we were playing 6-handed. Notice you can raise any suited ace, any suited Broadway hand, 2 cards 10 or higher, king 7 suited and better, ace 10 offsuit and better, king jack offsuit and better, pocket 5s and better, 10-9 suited, some 6-5 suited, and some 5-4 suited. Everything else just folds. So, very importantly here, what is folding? When you're looking at these charts, you want to look at where the cusp of playability is. Notice ace 9, king 10, and queen jack offsuit all fold, which implies everything worse than those hands also folds. You cannot play the ace 8, the king 9, the jack 4, the 7-2. You can't play any of those hands if they're offsuit. Notice the suited hands in this scenario. If they're not good, they're also folding for the most part. Notice queen 9 suited, 9-8 suited, 7-6 suited, 7-4 suited, 6-9 suited. They're all folding. They're all not quite good enough to call. Notice also, well, not good enough to call. They're definitely not good enough to call because no hand is. They're not good enough to raise. Notice 4s, 3s, and 2s are also folding. Now, these charts presume everyone plays perfectly, which they will not. So you can actually play a little bit wider than this. Notice ace 10 and king jack offsuit are raised about half the time and folded the other half the time. If you wanted to raise them every time, I think that's fine. King 5 suited and king 6 suited are played every once in a while. You can probably raise those every time. You can probably also raise queen 9 suited, jack 9 suited, all the suited connectors down to 5-4 suited, and all the pairs. That is wider than the game theory optimal strategy, but that is fine if your opponents are not going to re-raise you often enough yet to act, and if they're not going to play well after the flop. So I would recommend playing a little bit wider than this, but certainly not a lot wider than this. All right, from the button, what can you play? Notice any pair, king 2 suited and better, queen 3 suited and better, jack 5 suited and better, any 2 cards 6 or higher that are suited, 7-5 suited, 6-5 suited, and 5-4 suited. On the offsuit side, any 2 cards 9 or higher, and almost any ace-x offsuit. Everything else folds. On the button, if they fold to you and you have 8-7 offsuit, or ace-2 offsuit, or 6-5 offsuit, fold. They're not quite good enough to play. Now again, if the players in the blinds are a little bit too tight and passive, perhaps you can raise a little bit wider, but not a whole lot wider. Just a little bit, and most of the hands you're going to want to add are going to be either connected or suited. So that's tip number 1. Raise or fold when first in. Do not open limp. There's one exception when you're in the small blind, but we're not talking about that today. We're keeping things easy. Make sure you check out the cash game and tournament masterclasses at pokercoaching.com to cover all the common scenarios you will find yourself in. Tip number 2 is to stop calling raises with weak hands. When someone raises, they usually have a strong or decent hand. Okay? Also, everybody yet to act can also randomly wake up with a decent hand because they have 100% of hands, and 5 or 10% of the time, they're gonna have something really, really good. So when someone raises, this forces you to only continue against their range with strong hands and also hands that have a decent possibility to improve to a hand that can beat strong hands. These are gonna be mainly suited aces, suited high cards, suited connectors, and pairs. Everything else is gonna get out of the way. Let's take a look here at what we do in the hijack, which would be first act if there were 5 people at the table, versus the low jack, which would be first act if there are 6 people. So the low jack raises. What do we do in the hijack? Remember, the low jack is raising with this range here. So good hands, right? They do have some weaker hands in there, but mostly just good stuff. Against this range, you can see that we are folding a ton. Even hands like ace jack offsuit, king queen offsuit, king jack offsuit, queen jack offsuit, they're folding the vast majority of the time, if not every time. Notice the smallest pairs are folding. Lots of suited aces are folding. Lots of suited connectors are folding. And really only continuing with some suited aces, suited Broadway hands, and ace queen and better. And then like pocket 6s and better. And that's it. Everything else folds. Now, maybe you can play a little bit looser than this again, but not a whole lot looser. I'm telling you, if you play a whole lot looser than this in a 100 big blind deep cash game from out of position with, a few people, 3 players yet to act. Well, sorry, 2 players yet to act. The cutoff and the button in position against you. And then also the blinds who could 3-bet, you're going to get crushed. So in this scenario, you have to stop calling raises with stuff like queen 8 suited, king jack offsuit, ace 10 offsuit, 9 8 offsuit, 9 5 suited. These hands are not good enough to play. And if you consistently play these hands that are not quite good enough to play, little bits of money are going to be flowing your opponent's way. Let's take a look at the button versus a cutoff raise. The cutoff is the player to the right of the button. Notice in this scenario, we can get to play any suited ace, king 7 suited and better, any 2 cards 9 or higher, pocket 4s and better, and then king ace 10 offsuit and better, king jack offsuit and better, and a little bit of queen jack offsuit, plus a few suited connectors. Again, everything else is folding. Okay? This is a spot where if you have the ace 9 offsuit or jack 10 offsuit or 9 8 offsuit or 4 3 suited, let it go. It's okay. A lot of people think they're supposed to play loosey-goosey and have a sandwich. But if you're consistently playing loosey-goosey poker, if your opponents are not and they're actually trying to win and they're studying poker and working hard to try to crush you, what do you think is going to happen? Who's going to win? The players working hard to actively improve their skills and use good strategies, or the players who's playing loosey-goosey and having a sandwich? If you did want to play a little bit looser in this scenario, you could play more suited connected hands, maybe any 2 cards jack or higher, but that's about it. Maybe 3s and 2s you could play, but you don't need to be too insane. By the way, in this scenario, the hands in red are re-raised, the hands in green are called. We're not going to be discussing how to play those specific types of hands yet, but we're mainly focusing on the folds here. Notice that when someone raises, you don't get to play marginal stuff. Let's take a look at the small blind versus the button. So folds around to the button raises. Now, in the small blind, you're mostly going to be re-raising the hands you're going to play. And again, you're playing pretty tight. Remember, the button's raising with this very wide range, right? About 40-ish% of hands. They're raising 40-ish% of hands, but in the small blind, you have to be very tight because the big blind is yet to act, and they can call or re-raise and ruin your spot. So again, notice lots of offsuit hands fold, like ace 9 offsuit, king 10 offsuit, jack 10 offsuit, as well as a whole lot of suited stuff. Notice 9 8 suited, 8 7 suited, 5 4 suited, all the other suited junk. It's all just folding. What about the big blind versus a button raise? Remember, the button's raising this range. Notice how much tighter the big blind has to play than the button. Right? Notice they don't get to play with some of the offsuit stuff that the button gets to raise, right? Remember, they get to raise any 2 cards 10 or higher. We see over here the button folding the big blind folding some of those hands, right? Also notice the big blind does not call with any 2 cards or any 2 suited cards. If you're playing a tournament with an ante in play and no rate taken out of the pot, you actually will get to play a decent amount wider than this. But in a cash game, 100 big blinds deep, you're going to have to play a relatively tight strategy. Tip number 3 is to 3-bet aka re-raise, with a polarized range from in position. Something a lot of people do wrong is they re-raise, 3-bet, with only the best hands. And if you only re-raise with the best hands, well, what should your opponent do? When you re-raise, they should fold everything but the absolute best hands. And when you call, they know you don't have one of the absolute best hands, so you make yourself very easy to play against. Instead, you're going to want to do what is referred to 3-betting with a polarized range. The hands that are really good, the North Pole, and the hands that are not quite good enough to call or maybe barely good enough to call, the South Pole, right? You're 3-betting the best hands and the hands that are not quite good enough to call, while calling with what's called a condensed range, which are all the hands that are pretty good. They don't mind seeing a flop. Let's take a look at some examples. Here we have the hijack versus the low jack raise. Notice we are re-raising the hands in red here. Pocket queens and better and ace king. And then some suited aces, some suited kings that are not quite good enough to call perhaps, a few suited connectors, a few small pairs, not many, and then ace queen offsuit and some king queen offsuit as bluffs, right? So really the only strong value hands here that we're happy to play for a lot of money are aces, kings, queens, and ace king. Everything else is re-raising as a bluff. Notice the hands that are calling, which mainly good, strong suited Broadway hands and pairs. These are the hands that primarily want to call and see the flop and go from there. Again, notice what's not calling. Offsuit stuff. Offsuit stuff is not good. Let's take a look at the button versus a cutoff raise. In this scenario, we are 3-betting something like 10s and better, an ace king for value. And then again, hands that are perhaps not quite good enough to call. Some suited aces on the low end, suited kings, some suited connectors, and some offsuit Broadway hands. If you 3-bet ace 10 offsuit or ace jack and king jack and ace queen and even ace king queen and ace queen, if you 3-bet these and your opponent 4-bets you, especially if they use a big size, you're folding. A lot of people, they hate the idea that they're going to 3-bet with ace jack offsuit and then fold to a 4-bet. But you have to realize your range is very well protected with aces, kings, queens, and ace king. So your opponent can't just 4-bet you willy-nilly and smash you. It does not work. So recognize this is what you need to be doing. What a lot of people do wrong in this scenario, instead they 3-bet something like pocket 8s and better, ace 10 suited and better, ace 10 offsuit and better, king jack and better. And that makes their calling range weaker because it doesn't contain a lot of these good, strong suited hands that flop well. And it makes their 3-betting range super strong. So their opponent's strategy is very, very easy. You do not want to make your opponent's life easy. When your opponent plays well against you, because it's obvious what to do, you don't make any money. You make money when your opponents make mistakes. And when you're in position against a raise, 3-betting with a polarized range is going to naturally result in your opponents making all sorts of mistakes because they will not know if you have a very good hand or a hand that's perhaps not quite good enough to call. So that's it for today. These are my top 3 pre-flop tips for the low stakes poker games. Remember, number 1, raise or fold when first in. Do not open limp. Number 2, stop calling raises with weak hands. I know a lot of your opponents may be calling raises with weak hands, but that's why they're stuck at the low stakes. I don't want you to be stuck at the low stakes forever. I want you to move up. I want you to progress. And tip number 3 is to 3-bet with a polarized range from in position. We have a bonus tip. It is to study a lot. If you cannot beat the small stakes games today, or you're barely beating them, it implies you're not all that good at poker, or maybe you're playing in a game that has a gigantic rake. Either way, you need to work on improving your skills. Everyone who progresses from the small stakes to the middle stakes and the middle stakes to the high stakes, they all study poker a decent amount. Fortunately for you, I've done a lot of the hard work, developing all the materials you need to get good at poker quickly over at pokercoaching.com. Make sure you check it out and make good use of the resources. That's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, click the like and subscribe button down below. Also, if you have another pre-flop tip for the low stakes games that you think will help out the people in the comments down there, feel free to leave a comment. They would appreciate it. I appreciate it. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And make a point to play well before the flop. I'll talk to you next time.